and crack the book, as I say. And so tonight, as you can see from the title slide, we're going to look at one of the most famous, the most interesting parables that people have discussed and wondered and pondered for 2,000 years. And so what we're going to do, Lord willing, is we're going to kind of break this up into two parts. Part one tonight, part two next night, because I want to delve into some of the classical interpretation of this as we go through, and then next time dig deeper and see where it goes. So over the years, this parable has been interpreted in many ways. It's been used quite a bit over the centuries as a literal example of heaven. So when Chris mentioned that he was going to do a sermon series on heaven, I thought, excellent. And then I said, but conspicuous by its absence is stuff about heaven in the Bible. He said, yep. He said, that's why you got to put your big boy britches on and make it happen. And so I've enjoyed that so much, right? Because it's something that we all wonder about, but something that the Bible simply doesn't hardly address. What is heaven really like? Now, yes, we have the apocalypse of John that we call Revelation, a vision of John written to the living people of the day in these major cities along the major trade route, which I consider to be kind of like an encoded message for the people alive then to cheer them up, to encourage them that, hey, it doesn't matter what really happens to you, my brothers and sisters, in Ephesus, etc., etc., etc. Because let me tell you what's going to happen in the end. The end game is a done deal. And you can imagine if you're under severe persecution and everybody is against you, all the authorities are against you apparently, you need some encouragement. So is Revelation, though, those descriptions literally about heaven, and we can look at them? Wow, that's a good question, right? Now we can say, well, look at this vision that John had about heaven. The streets, John said, are like gold, but they're transparent like glass. Wait, that's an oxymoron. Those two cannot exist together. Gold is the most opaque thing I can think of. We use it to cover spacecraft to keep photons of light away from the spacecraft. So it's not like glass, but it's a vision, right? It's a vision. These things that I think in the three-dimensional us world, the human world, where we are stuck in the flow of time, where we only are aware of three dimensions, forward, backward, left, right, up, and down, that's all there is for us. That some of these things are just not understandable. They simply are not understandable. We remember Paul wrote about a man. I know a man who visited the third heaven. Now, in the ancient world, the first heaven was like the air that you're breathing and the birds fly. The second heaven is like where you can see the stars. The third heaven is beyond that. And so that's what we would tend to call today the heavenly realm, where God is, beyond the stars. And it's a good way to think about it. It's all there is. All you can think about is the way you can think, and that's all you've got. And so we're kind of in the same situation. So therefore, we often desperately turn to Lazarus and the rich man and try to get it to answer a question that I think it is never designed to answer. But we try to force it to answer, but it's not designed to answer, so what do? And then we come up with ideas like, if you're in hell, I've heard people say, from the pulpit and elsewhere, that you can actually see the people that are in heaven. You can see the saved people and vice versa. And the saved people can see you in the flames. And they can't cross because there's a great gulf, Luke said in the story of Lazarus and the rich man. Well, that's interesting, right? Is that really what it says? So let's dig in a little bit and see where this is going. So first of all, let me just back up a little bit. So if we You know, we've had this series on the parables, and it's been really tremendous. So even when Felix and I have been out of town, we always like to watch the YouTube versions. So all these wonderful presentations. I just love them. They're so great. So we have the parables. So that word there that we've inherited, parable. So it looks pretty simple, right? Parable is from a very common Greek word. Parabolo. That first part, para, means with or beside or alongside. And the second part of the word, balo, means I throw or I toss or I cast. So the very word itself means I am throwing something along with something. I'm casting something along with something. And so we often say parable, for a simple definition, is a heavenly story, but it's carried by an earthly story. Or more frequently, we'll hear this, an earthly story with a heavenly meaning, right? And that's pretty good. That's pretty good. And we know Jesus used this method all the time. A simple, common story that everybody of the day knows very, very well. There was a farmer sowing seed. Well, back in the first century, they were living basically directly from the land to the mouth, and so everybody knows this. They've seen sowers sowing seed. There was a guy who had a servant that was a crook. Okay, everybody's seen that. There was a wedding feast. Okay, we've all seen that. So these very, very common stories, nothing odd about them, but they're very memorable. Simple story sticks in your head, but it carries this important message. And the real purpose is the message. In all three of the Synoptic Gospels, in Matthew 10, in Luke 8, Mark 4, all of those three Synoptic Gospels have a little discussion about why Jesus taught in parables. The disciples come to Jesus just after the parable of the sower, and they said, "Master, what does this mean?" And I sympathize with that, right? These are the disciples that have been with Jesus every minute of every day, basically. And they're still a little bit puzzled. But they can go to Jesus and ask him, and he explained it to them. Mark says Jesus basically only taught in parables. A bit of hyperbole, I think, but nevertheless, the hyperbolic expressions are part of the Scriptures, as they are other writings. Interestingly, the Gospel of John has 0 parables. It is very, very unique. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, kind of looking with the same eye, synoptic. Gospel of John, 0 parables. But we have a bunch of them. If we look at all the ones that are duplicated in Matthew and Mark and John, kind of the same parable, and we count those as one, because it's one story, but it's in 3 expressions, Matthew, Mark, Luke. And if we do that, we find some parables are only in 1 book. Some parables are in 2, typically Matthew, Mark. Some parables are in all 3. But if we count them, each story is just one story. It's only about maybe 24 or so, 25, 26, depending on how you define a parable. A simple, simple story that carries a message. So, why did Jesus teach in parables? What do you guys think? Why? Why not just say it? Like parable of the sower. Why didn't Jesus say, "Okay, guys, look, you know what? You're going to go out and try to convince people about the good news. Some people will receive it, some people will never receive it, and some people kind of receive it for a little while and then they fade away. Okay, 1, 2, 3. There's my bullet points. There's my checklist. That's easy."
I think he tried to make his statements within the realm of their culture and how they lived every day, farming, and words that they could understand, but they still needed that background information. What are you actually saying? But he did put it in a way they could understand to a certain point.
Right. Very simple stories. Very simple, concrete, nothing weird, no odd story. It's all very simple things. Jerry?
Yeah, I like the way you said throw aside, to put aside, compare against, right? And kind of to his point, in my opinion, he gave them something that they could relate to day to day. Plowing and field, plowing that straight road, right? And then if he applied it to, getting out of line or pulling unequally, right? Or something along those lines, then they can relate to it on a day-to-day basis. If they're going down the field, they're thinking about that thing, those comparisons, and thinking spiritually.
Easy to remember, right? It's a simple story, but it carries this powerful meaning. A simple story they could retell to their friends and neighbors. I often say at whatever their version of Starbucks was or coffee. They would say, hey, did you hear that this new rabbi?
Rabbi Yeshua? Did you hear what he said the other? He was talking about farmer. And most people didn't understand it at all. It made no sense to them. But if you think about it a little bit, if you got a little skin in the game, if you're searching, knocking, seeking, think about it, you're going to go, I got it. Yes, sir.
You got to remember, too, the people were used to people, only the priest talking to them. And for the most part, I would imagine they talked down to them. And these were mostly uneducated people. The scribes and a lot of those people were the only ones that knew how to read. Common people really didn't in that day.
And they were shocked.
He taught like one that,
They had nobody that would talk to them with love
Yeah.
and try to make them understand it.
and they were shocked that he talked like somebody that knew what they was talking about, that had authority, right? Yeah, let me go back here and then I'll come to Phil. Yes, sir.
I think part of it too, I think Jesus was thinking about us because we had the added benefit of it bypasses age and culture because most of us can relate to a story about farming. It's like, okay, we can understand that basic principle. And no matter that it's, a couple hundred years later, we still can get the same message that they received from Jesus' teaching. So I think he was thinking about us in that
It's a
aspect.
very simple story that's easy to understand.
Understand. Although I know a number of inner city kids from LA when we lived there, they have zero concept of farming. Where does milk come from? No earthly idea, seriously. But how would they know, right? They've never been on a farm. They think, it comes from 7-Eleven, right? That's where milk comes from. Bless their hearts. Well, that's okay. We can dig in a little bit more deeply. But for that audience then, like I said, very agrarian, close to the land. Food went from land to mouth every day. Hence the Lord's Prayer. Give us today our daily bread, because they literally had to shop every single day. No preservatives in food. Bread went bad in a day. You had to go buy bread every day. No refrigeration, right? So your meat had to be fresh, et cetera, et cetera. Very close to the land. We're more and more separated. Yeah, Phil, you had a question?
Well, I was just going to say a couple of those points were something I was thinking about, but in the Jewish tradition, it was very much an oral tradition for their stories and their teachings and their because very few of them knew how to read, and so the lessons were passed on orally, hundreds of thousands.
There you go. And there was nothing really to read, right?
There was no printing press back then. That was like 1450s AD. So anything they could read had to be handwritten, which was super expensive. So the average person would not have access to even a single letter of Paul, if we were talking about post 60 AD or so, when the letters existed. Little churches could typically pool their money and hire a scribe and go find this church. Hey, you guys have a letter that Paul wrote to the Ephesians? Yeah, we got it. Could I send a scribe over to make our copy for our church? Well, yeah, sure, absolutely. It's going to be pricey. These guys were pricey, but they were good. And if you look at some of the oldest Greek manuscripts that are basically in the museum in Berlin and University of Michigan, there's a bunch of them. You can usually access them by high-def photos that you can just download. And you'll see on some of these old Greek manuscripts, the penmanship is beautiful. It looks like a typewriter almost. But this is like a reed pen, a bottle of ink, and that kind of rough, scratchy papyrus paper. It's hard to write on. But every letter is exactly the same height. The spacing is perfect. Well, we know people that have great penmanship, right? And then there's people like me that I've always written like a doctor, right? As they say. You just can't read it.
But you can write Greek. I mean, come on.
Actually, I just made this totally up. What do you mean? No, I'm just teasing. I'm just teasing. So, but the purpose of this is just to remind us that these are simple stories to a simple people, just like Jerry, you said. You know, how can you understand something if you're not really educated? You're not really reading stuff because there's nothing to read. You go to synagogue and they pull out the scroll of Isaiah, right? Or we've said Isaiah, right? And the synagogue owns that scroll, and they would roll it out. And to make it last longer, you would hold like kind of like an ink pen thing, a little stick, typically made of silver. And on the end of the stick, there was like a miniature hand, just like this. So, but like, quarter-inch wide, with the finger pointing out. And that was how you touched the vellum or the sheepskin or whatever the scroll is made of, so you're not transferring finger oils and dirt. So nothing ever touches it except that silver, which is antibacterial, by the way, interesting, that I'm not sure if they knew that or not. And that's how you read with this thing, the yad, the hand, the pointy finger. But only the synagogue with a bunch of people could afford that. Just think how blessed we are today. I can go online and get every version in the world basically for free. I can go buy a synthetic false leather Bible of any kind for like $14.95. The whole Bible. It's astonishing how blessed we are. And here it is. Now, do we crack the book frequently enough? Well, that's another story. Okay, let's look here at Lazarus and the rich man and talk about a few points, and then we'll delve in, we'll work our way through. We'll come back and talk about some of the cultural imperatives that the people then would know explicitly, but we don't know today. Someone once said, to really understand the ancient text, you need to forget all of the things that you know that the people in the first century did not know. And you have to try to know all the things that people in the first century knew that we don't know today. Now, of course, that's impossible to do that 100%. But still you can dig in a little bit, because these people that are writing the New Testament for us are all Jews. Now, some people will debate me about Luke as being a Gentile, but I think the great preponderance of the evidence doesn't support that. I think he was a Jew also. And so they're coming from this Jewish perspective. And the Hebrews tend to express ideas by painting pictures with words. So it's a very concrete type of expression. By concrete, I mean using real objects that you can taste, touch, feel, where our culture is mainly abstract. I have to go find a dictionary and I find this word. The word doesn't mean anything by itself. It just like has some sounds, but I can look it up and it's kind of abstract. So for example, my favorite example is today we would say, okay, Sharon, can I pick on you? Is that okay? Why are you so stubborn? Now, she's not, but I'm just using that as an example. Well, stubborn. Okay, that's just some words, stubborn. We can go get the dictionary, look it up, stubborn. What's that mean? And then there will be several definitions. We can go, oh, okay, that's an abstract concept, but now I know what it means. But in the Hebrew culture, they would just say, why is your neck so stiff? Well, I know what a neck is. It's right there. I know when something is soft and squishy and versus hard and stiff. So they're painting a picture, but what it means, stubborn. And all through the old scriptures, it's like that over and over again. You go, whoa, what an odd way to say this. That's just the way they thought. Very concrete, building a picture. And so in Lazarus and the rich man, and all the other parables, all the other sweep of the New Testament and the Old Testament, painting pictures that mean something. If we're not careful, we can get lost in the paint and the canvas, as it were, and miss the message that the picture is telling us. So what are some notable points about Lazarus and the rich man? Number one thing, as I mentioned, is only in the Gospel of Luke. So we call this a single tradition narrative. Only appears in one book, only Luke. So thank goodness for Dr. Luke, or we wouldn't have this, we wouldn't have the prodigal son and a few other examples. Thank you, Dr. Luke. It's the only parable, and I put this in quotes, because I don't think it's a classic parable. And I'll tell you why a little bit later. It's the only parable to actually name a person, Lazarus. Only parable. So that tells me right away, this seems like something is unique about this parable. Something is different. Something is different, maybe. Interestingly, this name Lazarus is the Greek form of the Hebrew name Eleazar, which means El is one of the Hebrew words for God, means God. Azer means helper, ally. Remember over in Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve? It is not good for Adam, human. It's not good for the human to be only, to be one. I will make, the King James says, a help meet. I will make an Azer suitable. Help meet. Now that's Old English, right? Meet means suitable for. Help. But in our culture today, that sounds kind of like a subordinate position. You know, I'm going to hire 3 or 4 helpers to come put these fence posts in for me. I'm the boss. They're the helpers. But that word Azer is almost always used in reference to God is my help. God is my Azer. God is my helper. God is my ally. So I think it's very interesting that God said it's not good for man to be alone. I need an ally for you, an ally. Not a subordinate at all. That's not implicit in the text whatsoever. But yet we've inherited that concept. Bless our hearts. So it's interesting that the name here, the only name given in any parable, Eleazar, God is my helper. God is my ally. And it's the only parable that is not just an earthly scene, an earthly story. A wedding, a farmer sowing. This has 2 scenes, an earthly scene and a Hades scene. Only parable that does that with these 2 scenes, earthly and beyond the earth. That also tells me something is odd about this story. The only one of all the parables? Maybe it's not really a classic parable. Maybe it's something else. Maybe yes, maybe no. Now, of course, I always do this either in my head or let's do it on paper. I always like to set the stage and look at the context because that's going to really help me zoom in on what's going on. So I always like to ask the newspaper reporter questions. And sometimes I'll get a scrap of paper and actually write it down just to help me think. So I'll ask who is speaking and to whom, where and when is this going on, what actually was the interaction, and now the last question, which is often very hard, why? Why? So if we look at this section, the story of Lazarus and the rich man in Luke 16, then the who is fairly simple. Jesus is talking. Now the audience, that's a little bit tougher, but if we back up just a little bit in chapter 16, and we look at chapter 16, verse 14, once again, Jesus and the Pharisees, they're at it again. The Pharisees, and now Luke reminds us, who were lovers of money. Now, when Jesus does this, he's talking, I'm pretty confident in this, he's talking to the temple leadership Pharisees, not Pharisees all across the country, because there are a lot of them. But he's always criticizing the religious leader Pharisees. And secular history tells us these guys were largely crooks. You could not bring foreign currency into the temple because it had an image of a person. You're not supposed to have any graven image, the Hebrews taught. And so you had to change your money for money that did not have any image of any person on it. And so when you changed your money to go in the temple, before you could offer your alms, then I have to have a little bit of extra for my trouble, right? So there's an exchange rate differential. Give me $1 in Roman coins, and I'll give you 77 cents. Sweet, you can make a lot of money doing this. And they did make a lot of money doing this, a lot of money. doing this. So Jesus is really chomping at these guys. They were a lover of monies. They heard all the things he was saying, and they made fun of him. I mean, they were always doing this. Bless their hearts. They were always doing this. He was always, that's one of the great tragedies of the Gospels. The very people that are supposed to be the leaders of the people, religious leaders, are kind of the crooks. Or at least they're so woefully mistaken. Okay, maybe they're not all crooks, although we do know some were crooks. But they're so woefully mistaken, they miss the point. And Jesus always reminds them, you have heard it said, Jesus says in Matthew, you should love your neighbor and hate your enemy, right? But no, I tell you, and then he goes back to reveal the purpose of the law, which they keep missing. And he said to the Pharisees, verse 15, you guys just spend all of your time, now of course I'm super paraphrasing here, you spend all your time looking good before people, so they will say, oh look, oh wonderful priest so-and-so, rabbi so-and-so, we love to see you in the marketplace, you love the best seats in the synagogue, you love to be honored and respected. Well, knock yourself out, I guess. But God knows your hearts. There's the key. I think that's a very important key before Jesus enters into this story of Lazarus and the rich man. The Pharisees and other people are listening. He chomps on the Pharisees, the temple leadership Pharisees again, and he says, you guys, all you're after is earthly stuff. Money, power. Honor, basically. God knows your heart. God knows your heart. Now, when is this happening? Well, it's not really defined very much. Somewhere like middle of Jesus' ministry. Where? In Jerusalem. If we go back to chapter 13, he's traveling toward Jerusalem. He's lamenting Jerusalem. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I would gather you to me like a chick gathers her little babies, but you would not. You who kill the prophets. He goes through this soliloquy. It's painfully beautiful. And then in chapter 15, here he is in Jerusalem, and he's hanging out with the riffraff again. Luke says with sinners and tax collectors and scribes and Pharisees. Now the what is the story we're going to look at, the story of Lazarus and the rich man. The why, now here's our big question, why? What were the people supposed to get from this back then, and what can we get from it today? If we contextualize it to modern day, how's it going to help me understand better, live better, behave better, whatever? That's the question. And so I hope to elucidate that a little bit as we go through part 1 and part 2. Now the two scenes, earthly scene and then a Hadean scene, Hades. Now we have to back up just a little bit and talk about this word Hades. There's a couple of translations that will say hell right there, but that's not in the text. It is actually Hades. In English we'd write Hades. Now it's well known that the people of the day, from Roman Greek culture, they have a concept of multiple gods from Mount Olympus. We look at the gods, the Greek gods, the Roman gods just have different names, but it's the same group. And one of the chief gods was named Hades. Zeus, Poseidon, Hades. Those are three brothers, kind of the top dogs. Of course, Zeus was the top dog. But Hades, the god, was the god of the underworld. Poseidon, god of the sea. And then Zeus, god of the skies, basically. And that was their understanding, and so that's what they thought. Now, the idea is, and what they taught their kids, they said, okay, kids, look. A little kid would say, Daddy, what happens when you die? And they said, well, everybody knows that. When you die, you go to Hades. That's where the dead go. That's the dwelling place of the dead. And in Hades, there's two sections. There's a section for the bad folk that need some punishment, and that's called Tartarus. And there's a section for the good folk that should be rewarded for their good behavior. And that's the Elysian fields. Does that ring a bell back from high school Greek mythology? And so it's interesting that we're kind of playing off that Roman Greek understanding, because by this time, Jerusalem, all of Samaria and Judea had been under Roman control since 63 BC. So now here's Jesus, roughly, let's say 30-ish AD. So almost 100 years. The Romans, who were really fond of Greek knowledge and so forth, so they had adopted so much stuff from the Greek culture because they thought it was really cool. And so for 100 years, this has kind of been the teachings and the beliefs of the people in control of Samaria and Judea. The Romans, basically. So let's talk about the earthly scene first. So if you've got your Bibles handy, let's go ahead and turn to the 16th chapter of Luke. And the story starts with verse 19. So I'll just read this from the English Standard Version. The New King James does a nice job with this. Even the Old King James does a nice job with this. So let's just go through it. In a couple of spots, I'll make a commentary from the underlying Greek text. So the first verse starts out in what Luke actually wrote. Luke wrote, "There was a certain man who was plusios, who was very, extremely wealthy." Now, most of our versions say there was a rich man. That's a little bit weak, but it's okay. There was a certain man who was very wealthy. That's what Luke wrote. And he puts wealthy at the end of the sentence, which gives it extra emphasis. And in Greek, you can do those kind of things. The syntax is not as important, the word order, so you can move things around to emphasize words that you want to. So that word comes at the end of the sentence in that primary important position. This certain man who was very rich was clothed in purple and fine linen. So we're painting a picture already. What are the people thinking about that are hearing this? Well, to us, purple, I mean, what does that mean to us today? You stop somebody. Well, but today, what's it mean? Well, I got a purple T-shirt. You know, I got a Van Halen. You're an LSU fan. Yeah, go Tigers, something like that, right? So to us, it's nothing. Because in the modern era, we have clothing is so easy to make and it's so easy to color. We have all these chemical dyes that can stain anything, any color in the world. But in the ancient day, not so. All they had was certain types of clay, so you could stain clothes like brown, tan, maybe rusty color. And that was it. So most people didn't bother. If you had wool clothing, it was just the color of the sheep. So what color is that? Maybe off-white, tan, dark brown maybe. That was it. Cotton, kind of like off-white. Linen, kind of off-white. So it's very monochromic, right? Very monochromic. But in about 1600 BC, the Phoenicians discovered that if you smush this sea snail, I'll show you a picture in just a minute. If you smush the snail that grows in the Mediterranean Sea, when the snail juice is exposed to the oxygen in the air, boom, it turns purple. And this beautiful purple. And more importantly, it's absolutely color fast. If it gets on your clothes, it will never come out. And as it ages, it just gets better. Wow, what a dye that is. But it's very pricey, and most people can't afford it. So this guy wore purple. Now there's some yarn stained with this stuff called Tyrian blue. It's called Tyrian blue because it was mainly produced by the people in Tyre. Woe to you, Tyre and Sidon. Rich, rich, rich city of Tyre. Because they were really good at harvesting these sea snails, chomping them up, making dye, and they were selling this super expensive dye to the super rich people. And so here's the map. And so here is Israel, up in what is now Lebanon, right on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, Tyre. And so they would harvest these snails, smush them up, and sell this purple dye that was super expensive. So you can only harvest these snails like in wintertime, maybe early spring. And as best we can tell, it takes about 10,000 of these little snails. Probably about half a dozen would fit in my hand. They're pretty small. It would take about 10,000 of them to make 1 gram of this purple dye. Now, 1 gram, that's about the weight of half of a U.S. penny. 10,000 to make half of a weight of a penny? I mean, yeah, like not even a thimbleful. No wonder it's horribly expensive. And how many people do you have to go harvest them and smush them up and clean out all the guts and the debris and just keep the dye? Super, super expensive. In some areas, it was actually illegal, even if you could afford it, to have anything purple because it was reserved for royalty, the king, and so forth. Remember in Acts 16, Lydia, when Paul was visiting Philippi, Lydia was a seller of purple. Super luxury good. This is like today, I'm selling Ferraris. I specialize in Ferraris and Rolexes, and so she probably was very wealthy. Well, we know she had 2 homes. She had a home in Philippi, a home in Thyatira. So she must have been pretty well off, seller of purple. But isn't it a beautiful color? Now, of course, the projector doesn't do it justice. It's really a beautiful purple. Probably better. Nope, the TVs are off. But it's actually better. Now, here's the little snails. The genus is Murex snails. Like I said, about a half a dozen would fit in my hand. They're fairly small. Smash them up. They're exposed to oxygen. Boom, turns purple. You can see a little bit of purple in that middle one there. Like I said, this Tyrian purple is color fast. A few years ago, they were excavating in Pompeii, the archaeologists were, and they came across a little sealed vial. And they said, oh my God, what's in this? And it was Tyrian purple. And it was, like 1,600 years old. So they opened it up in the lab, got a little bit out. Perfect. Still perfect. 1,600 years. Amazing stuff. And so there's 10,000 snails to make about a 1 gram. And then here's the reference, Acts 16, 14, 15 for Lydia, seller of purple. So we know this guy was a certain rich man. Yeah, he wore purple stuff. Wow, that's very expensive. And he wore fine linen. Now today, we know what linen is. Yeah, it's nice. It's linen. What's that mean back then to those people as they were listening to it? So the word that Luke used is this word, bousos. Bousos. And we know what bousos is. It's this ultra fine, super expensive Egyptian linen that is so light and almost transparent that the people of the day called it woven air. And it's typically used for undergarments. So basically what's Luke saying? There was this guy who was really rich. He went around in purple clothing and he wore woven air underoos, basically. Wow. Expensive. Showing off with your purple. Now, I guess you're not showing off your woven air Egyptian linen underwear, but I don't know, maybe you brag about it so people will know. Furthermore, the text says that he feasted luxuriously every single day. Now, back in the day, I know I've heard Chris mention this, that there was really no middle class, right? That's a modern post-industrial revolution thing that we just are so used to. We think that's the way it's always been. No, no, no. There was a couple of percent of people that were really rich, and everybody else was struggling to find enough to eat. Poor, 90-something percent, and the rich 2 or 3 or 4%. That's the way it was. So if you are having trouble finding enough to even eat, and here's this guy that is having a big party, a big feast every single day. Luxuriously is the word that Luke uses. We also know that he had a big house apparently because he had a gated courtyard, because this poor beggar that we're going to see next was laid at his gate. So, okay, gated house, wears purple, wears woven air underwear, has parties and feasts every single day. Meanwhile, everybody else is half starving to death. Now, Luke is going to contrast this. Look at the next contrast. This story is a story of contrasts. So there was a poor man named Lazarus, Eleazar, God is my helper. Interesting, no name for the rich guy. But for Lazarus, he has the honor of being named. Rich guy's anonymous, we don't know. He was laid, most of our texts say, beside the rich man's gate. Now that word there that Luke uses, balo, is a bit more aggressive the way Luke uses it. Thrown aside. That would be a better translation. Cast off. So laid gives us the idea that he was gently laid down by the rich man's gate. No, it's like he's an outcast of society. So we're going to kick him over there against the curb. Cast off by the rich man's gate. Now, why would he be cast off? Because he was covered with sores. He's unclean. Remember, in the Hebrew view, if you have skin disease, these were often called leprosy just as a general category. You were unclean. And anybody that touched you was unclean. Covered by sores. This guy was sick. A sick guy who was cast off by society, laying down, kicked to the curb by the rich man's gate, covered with sores. He was so hungry. He just wanted to have some crumbs off the rich man's table. Now, if we contextualize that to today, we might say something like, he had to go through the garbage cans to find something to eat. Something like that. This is really, really sad. And then now finally, to add insult to injury, Luke says, moreover, the dogs came to lick his sores. Now, back in that day, dogs were not pets. They were not fuzzy little, Fido and so forth. This is like a modern sort of American, British, Western culture, some other cultures too. Dogs were scavengers, nasty, stinking, unclean scavengers. Now, the question, and I still ponder this all the time, is this statement a positive or is it a negative? What do you think? I mean, in one way, dogs are coming by and licking sores. Does that mean I don't have enough energy to shoo them off? Or does that mean the only things that care enough for me to come clean my sores are nasty scavenging dogs? In contrast to the rich man who does nothing for me. Zero. So in other words, the rich man by that comparison is worse than a dog. So when you guys first hear this, first read it, what do you think of? Is that positive or negative?
I've heard that saliva helps heal sores.
Well,
That's why dogs lick their
dogs will lick their own wounds, right? Kind of clean it up a little bit. Could be. It could be that the only person that would show him any mercy whatsoever were nasty, slimy, scavenging dogs. Unlike the rich man who did doodly. Let me go here and then I'll come over here, Chris.
If you go to a third world country, there's dogs that, they just roam the streets. And they're the nastiest, mangiest dogs you can find. And so when I read this is what I'm picturing, that he, kind of like what you said, the first option, right? He is just such in bad shape that he just can't get rid of these dogs.
So you're thinking more of a negative?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because he just doesn't have the energy to shoo them off. Maybe?
Yeah.
Chris, what do you think? Positive? Negative?
Well, I was going to say the same thing Ben said, but maybe a little bit of twist on it in the sense that you go to these countries and they are the nastiest things. I mean, I have to tell everybody, do not, because you're generally speaking, it's about 3 or 4 days in, somebody has wanted to touch and pet one of the not as nasty dogs, and I end up having to be mean to the dog, and because if not, they're going to start bringing all the nasty ones around, and so when you see this scenario right here, this isn't one of our little pets that we carry over here and they cut up their hair. This is nasty, mangy things. And he said, castaway. And he's at the gate. The place is designed to keep him out. This is as far as I want you to come near me. I'm putting up this kind of hedge around me. And
riff-raff, nasty people.
The dogs are there because the dogs, if there's dogs, they usually congregate somewhere where there's food. There's something to be had. And so the rich Lazarus, you said he's there to eat his trash. That's probably at his trash heap. That's probably where he's at.
It could be.
And so you're seeing the dogs there. Lazarus is kind of just, the way I see it, he's scattered amongst the nastiest, the dogs.
Could be.
As it were.
I always think, though, I wonder, could it be a further attack on the rich man? That the rich man, full of money, wore purple, had, silk underoos on, etc. Feasted every single day. Couldn't he have thrown Lazarus a pork chop or something?
Well, I think that's the dichotomy of it, is that it shows both.
The contrast,
Is
right?
that you see this guy over here with the nastiest, and look how you've treated him.
And who shows him the most mercy?
Right.
The rich guy who has plenty of money, wouldn't miss it. No, it's the dogs that at least kind of come and lick the ooze off his sores. Maybe that's it's like a severe mercy in a way, if you can believe that. Okay, so that was our bell, which brings us exactly to the beginning of part 2 for next week. So part 2 now, Luke is going to switch to not an earthly scene, but a Hades scene. No other parable does anything like this remotely. So now, what's the Hades scene? Remember that the Greeks and the Romans taught that Hades is where the dead people go. It corresponds to Sheol in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew. So are you going to the good compartment of Hades, the Elysian fields? Or are you going to the bad compartment, Tartarus, where you'll be punished? And that's kind of the underlying Greek-Roman thought going on here. Now, these Pharisees and so forth, they're really into the Greek stuff and the Roman stuff because that's cool. That's how you show off. That's your fancy stuff. So they really love to be Hellenistic Jews, Greek Jews. So next time, we'll look at this, Lord willing. So when you have some time today, go back to the story and now read the earthly scene again. And then now notice the switch over to the Hades scene and see what happens in Hades and how Luke is painting this very Hebraic picture, painting this picture of what's happening and what we can learn from it. And so, thank you so much for comments and questions. Lord willing, we'll pick up next week in Hades.